Our next guest, he seemed pretty calm and cool and ready to go on the phone line with us here, and he's a supply chain expert, the president of Crean, James Crean himself. We're going to talk a little bit about what we should be expecting, what we need to know right now, what is currently happening with our supply chain. James, good morning. We appreciate you joining us here on the program, and thank you for giving us some insight of your expertise here on what we need to know.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, so what should we be paying attention to? What is the biggest industry right now being affected? I know obviously we're paying attention to the high gas prices, but what are maybe some of the things that we don't really know that could just creep up and bite us when we're not paying attention?
Well, it's varied actually. So the thing is that Russia, with all the natural gas that they produce, they turn the nitrogen and natural gas into fertilizer, and a lot of people may not realize that 90% of our fertilizer comes from Russia. So we're getting ready to plant crops this spring, and our farmers are going to be looking for fertilizer, and that could become a pretty critical issue pretty quickly. So that's certainly something we have to keep an eye on. Another one that's a little bit more obscure as well is neon gas. 50% of our neon gas we get from the Ukraine, and neon gas is used for a number of things, obviously neon signs that we're all familiar with, but also neon lasers that are used in producing semiconductors. So the semiconductor crunch that we've been suffering through and causing our car prices to go through the roof and deliveries to be delayed could get worse as the semiconductor delays continue and across all of our different electronics. So those are a few. There's more beyond that.
Yeah, and so I think, James, that's kind of touching upon some of the everyday average consumer type products, but I know some of the focus in your industry has to do with aerospace, engineering, and things of that nature. So how it is, what kind of effects is it having on bigger industries or industries of advancement and engineering that may be putting a hold on certain things of leading us to the next technology, the next advancement, the next gear?
Yeah, well, you're right. We work with aerospace companies as well as industrial companies and helping them in manufacturing and engineering and the rocket engines that are used on the American Atlas V launch vehicle rocket those engines are made in Russia, United Launch Alliance, who launches that, luckily have been working for years on coming up with a replacement, and they're close to getting a Blue Origin made engine ready for a new rocket system that they've been developing called Vulcan. But that system hasn't launched yet, and there's always challenges in new development. So they're working through that, and hopefully that'll start to fly later this year. But a lot of our national security assets, satellites like GPS satellites that we all use for our phones to get from here to there, those satellites are oftentimes launched on Atlas V rockets, so that transition is important. And there's other launch systems like the Antares launch system, which is used for getting supplies up to the International Space Station. That uses a rocket engine made by Russia as well. So there's collaborations that are coming to a screeching halt with the sanctions, and the Europeans do even more collaborations on the space side with the Russians, and they actually launched a Soyuz Russian rocket out of their launch facility in French Guiana in South America, and those launches have come to a halt. So it affects quite a bit across the industry.
James, prior to the Ukrainian invasion, there have been supply chain issues, and I wonder, from your perspective, to what extent these supply chain issues were caused by the policy in Washington to pay people for not working.
Well, I mean, the inflation numbers that we just saw, 7.9% inflation, which is the highest in 40 years, was for February. That was prior to the invasion of Ukraine. That's entirely all pre the Ukraine war issue. And we've been seeing this from the beginning, right? I mean, the beginning of this was day one, actually, in the Biden administration, when they effectively declared war on our oil and gas industry, which meant that our drilling stopped in a lot of areas. Our expansion of drilling stopped, and so we became more reliant on foreign oil. Prior to that, we were energy independent, and so those issues, ripple through the entire supply chain. Whereas, also, of course, the COVID issues created, having people out of work. COVID was, or the Omicron variant. Oftentimes companies saw 10% of their workforce not showing up to work, and part of the challenge there was, the administration bought 500,000 tests right before the COVID spike, and they cornered the market on tests. So people couldn't get tests, home tests, so they assumed that they had COVID if they got sick and they stayed home. And so, we had, there's a lot of different interplay here. Policy definitely had an impact and continues to have an impact, and we don't really have a clear strategic plan for how to solve most of these problems. Energy is not something you turn on like a spigot.
Right.
When you shut down a pipeline, the building of a pipeline, the XL, like the Keystone XL pipeline, it can take months or longer to get those workers back. They had families. They were in small towns along the build route of that area. They had kids in school. They've moved. They're gone. They don't just up and go back when somebody says they're back online. So, and I don't see any indications that there's going to be any policy changes towards that. We seem to be more interested in talking to terrorist countries like Iran and Venezuela than friendly Texans and Oklahomans and North Dakotans. So I don't quite understand that, but that's not my policy.
I mean, there's a lot of issues here, and like some of the items you mentioned, they're for a lot of the products we have, or the technology, or even in some cases medicine. And some of these supply chains are all over the world. We have a global marketplace now, and you're sooner or later, whether it's today with Russia or tomorrow with China or who knows what, we're going to find situations again and again where our adversaries have access to the materials any country needs, the Western Hemisphere needs to sustain its economy. So either it's going to we're constantly going to be jammed up with our adversaries here, causing problems with our products and our economies, or what you hear some Republicans doing in other voices saying, we need to rearrange our supply chains so they're not going through our adversaries that can hold it against. We went through this a lot with China during the pandemic in terms of what they had kind of control over. So realistically, though, is there any real way to rearrange, redesign our supply chain system to really make it immune to these global unpredictabilities? Because otherwise, we're just going to have to deal with these crises over and over and over again as the world becomes a more hostile place.
That's such an important question. The reality is that China thinks strategically. Their whole Belt and Roads initiative is focused on developing those relationships and inking those relationships, across the globe, in order to get their hands on some of those critical natural resources all around the world, whether it's energy resources or rare earth metals or other commodities, in Africa, Asia, across the world. So it's a combination of a strategic plan that has to be considered at the at the federal level. Our country needs to have a strategic plan for how we're going to ensure that we have access to the core materials that we need. I have 100% confidence in American workers and American businesses and American entrepreneurs to turn those raw materials into amazing products here in the United States. That's what we do. We work with companies, all day long. We're helping companies reshore their manufacturing here to the United States or make their manufacturing here significantly more efficient using smart manufacturing methodologies and technologies. But it's, you can't make something if you don't have the materials to make it, and that's what we're seeing, and that's exactly what you're pointing out with pharmaceuticals, for instance. So many of the materials needed to make our key pharmaceuticals are sourced out of places like China, and they have the opportunity to corner those markets because we've allowed that to happen, right. And we have to have a more strategic view of what's happening. And China is the really big concern. We can put, sanctions on Russia, and it hurts because of some of the things that we've talked about earlier, but shutting down Chinese economy, the whole world is so tied into the Chinese economy, that would be almost impossible. So I think China's looking at this situation and realizing they might have the leverage to do whatever they want, right. And that's a pretty scary thing.
James, how I see in the write-up that you're passionate about bringing manufacturing jobs back to the U.S., and you heard Biden say some of that in his State of the Union speech. But how do American manufacturers compete with foreign manufacturing plants where in the United States you have to have social programs that are built into the wages? You have to have paid family leave. You have to have vacations. You have to have health insurance. You have retirement benefits. Every time you hire a worker, you have all these social programs that you're paying for when you're paying the worker, whereas when you go to some other countries where they can manufacture the same product, they don't have all those built in, and they have a far lower cost of labor. How does an American manufacturer compete with that situation, with a labor-intensive product? I understand if it's not labor-intensive, it's one thing, but if it's a labor-intensive product, how do they compete?
I'm glad you asked. When you look at the overall economy, manufacturing economy, and look at some of just the big picture statistics, Chinese labor is about 6 times cheaper than U.S. labor, and so the natural tendency is to say, all right, well, hey, we should do all of that manufacturing in China because it's going to be cheaper. But when you look at how many workers are doing that work in China and how many workers are doing similar work in the United States, it turns out that U.S. workers are 8 times more productive than Chinese workers. So even though China is 6 times cheaper on a labor cost per hour basis, that higher productivity in the United States is really what our superpower is. And I'll be honest with you, we work with a lot of manufacturing companies across the country, and we're not very efficient. Even though we are more productive than anybody else, there's such opportunity there. We work with companies and double productivity of their people and machinery on a regular basis. And that just opens up markets and allows those workers to be able to create more product and have those companies become more and more successful within their industry, and honestly take that manufacturing back from China. We worked with a company in upstate New York there that in a matter of a few months took their productivity up by a factor of 10. They were struggling because they didn't have enough workers to deal with new business that they had coming in, and we helped them engineer their processes and got to where their workers were able to do the product that they had more efficiently, and as a result, that freed up the labor that they needed to be able to move into a whole new product line. It was a union shop. These guys were really great, well-paid jobs. They were doing a great job. And they just needed more of them, and they couldn't find the workers. But they were, but by creating those efficiencies, they were able to move into those new markets. And now they've had a great, successful business in that area for years.
So it is here, James. I think as the point you're making, and we just need to maybe look at and restructure how we do things in some cases. Efficiency, knowledge, continued and furthered education in some of these fields.
Yeah, we think about things in terms of people, process, and technology, and we're just huge believers in the American workers. We know that we can help them to be as productive as possible by putting in great processes and then putting in technology. So many people focus on the technology first, and there's certainly advancements in technology. And I know there's some people that get concerned that technology is going to replace the American worker and things like that. That's not our experience at all. Our experience is that by putting in the right solution, a combination of people, process, and technology, you make that company stronger. You create new markets for them, and you bring that manufacturing back to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
We worked with another company that had 40% of their manufacturing was in China. We doubled the productivity of the plant so that then they could bring all of that manufacturing right back to the United States.
Creates that competitiveness that we need.
Yeah, let's put some Chinese workers out of business.
Yeah.
Let's focus on that for a change, huh?
Yeah.
How do you make the worker more productive by more capital investment? You have more, you purchase more capital goods that will replace the worker, or that the worker can use to replace the worker. Is that essentially how you make the worker more productive?
You know what? Actually, no. We've really focused first on the people and the process part. It's how do you make the process efficient and effective, and how do you manage the process, the priorities in that process, whether it's a manufacturing process, a service process, or even product development. How do you make those processes work really effectively and efficiently first? And then you start looking at technology that helps to improve the visibility and the insight, the analytics, and those types of things that can help you to be more productive from there. Most of the time, the companies start to invest in capital far too early, right? I always say it doesn't make any sense to automate a process that hasn't been perfected yet, right? If your process is producing, not producing the quality product that you want, or that, then there's no point in automating that, right? You want to get the process right first. So.
All right, James. I'm just great job. I was just looking through some of our listeners' response. I know you got to run. I want to ask you this question though, because I think it's important. How much does do environmental constraints play a role in some of the regulations that we may have here in our country, opposed to what you might see in other countries?
Yeah, it's a great question. This is one of those things that it bothers me as well. So we push manufacturing to countries that don't have environmental regulations in the interest of, not, or push oil production, for instance, to countries that have no environmental regulations. And we think that we're saving the environment by doing that, when in fact all we're doing is just creating environmental issues at the other side of the globe, and not managing the environment here at home, where we could be, where we have better environmental regulations. And
paying less for the product, possibly as well.
Yeah, well, exactly, and so listen, I'm an environmentalist. I want clean water. I want clean air, and but that doesn't mean that we should now push all of our manufacturing and production out of the United States. And for that, we can produce products here safely and effectively. It can't be over the top. We have to balance the regulation with the business requirements. But you know what? Making somebody sick overseas is not a good replacement for trying to not make somebody sick here in the United States. I'm not a fan of that kind of a solution. So let's push on our partners overseas to improve their environmental regulations if we really believe that those regulations are critical to health and safety of people.
Great.
It's people first. Focus on great jobs, keeping them healthy, keeping them happy, and let's focus on that first. No matter where the business is.
Great response. Rocco, you good? We'll let James. James, great job. I'm glad we touched base here this morning, and love to have you back on. And I'm sure there's going to be plenty of time and plenty more to talk about when it comes to not only the supply chain issues, but just the effects that we're going to see on the economy and how it's going to affect us here for quite some time in reaction to what's going on there in Ukraine. James, if folks want to find out more about the company, go ahead. What's the best way?
Our website is creaninc.com, CREANINC.com, and absolutely love to help any companies here in the U.S. that are looking to improve their product development and their engineering and manufacturing, make them more globally competitive. So thank you so much, guys, for the time today. It's really been a pleasure.
You got it. Love to have you again, and enjoy the weekend. James, thanks for joining us.